I had just got my colleagues because I wasn't sure how this was going to work. We're going to start. Welcome all of you and welcome to our excellent panel that we have here. My name is Sunita Dhar and I work with a women's feminist collective called Jagori in Delhi and works in several states of the country. As we take the session forward, titled Recognizing the Role of Structures and Ideologies in Work with Men, and as the briefing note says, this is to examine how structural and institutional inequalities, feminist theory, laws and social norms all inform and influence our efforts to engage men in work to promote gender equality. Our first speaker to my left is Sanjeev Upreti, and we welcome you, Sanjeev. He is going to talk on masculinities and violence, social norms, social structure and law. He is a professor of English at the Tribhuvan University, Nepal. Thank you for being with us. And I'll just do a quick introduction. Sanjeev has completed his PhD from Brown University with a focus on masculinity studies. He has done his postdoctoral research at Harvard, UC Berkeley Universities, very recently, 2012-2013, and we're honored to have you here, Sanjeev. Our second speaker on my right here is Noor Hashim. He is going to present his paper on Towards Pro-Feminist Politics, a study of men's movement for ending violence against women in Indonesia. He's a social activist from the School of Humanities and Social Inquiry, Faculty of Law, Humanities and the Arts, the University of Wollongong, have I said it right? Yeah. Australia. He's also a co-founder of Aliansi Laki-Laki Baru in Indonesia, a national network of pro-feminist men who work on gender equality. To my right is Michael Flood. He's going to make a presentation on work with men to end violence against women, critical assessment and future directions. He's a senior lecturer on sociology at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and I believe there's a student-teacher relationship right here. And not only is he a researcher and an educator, he's an activist, and his research focuses on the primary prevention of violence against women, men, and gender, and young men. Welcome, Michael. And then I come to David. David Abbotsturbaum is from Columbia University, and he is going to be making his presentation very interestingly, and some of us are now objects of your research, Technologies of Implosion, Dissent and Governance in the 2012-2013 Anti-Sexual Violence Protests in New Delhi. So he is with the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University, and he has recently completed his bachelor degree at the university, and his research background focuses on ethnic studies, queer theory, gender and sexuality studies. And welcome to amongst the youngest in this panel, and welcome to each and every one of you. We're very happy to have you all, and there's enough space. This is an activist room, so come and sit wherever. As long, and I seek your cooperation because of the logistics upstairs. I know that we may not be able to take up everybody's questions, but please, we will have to close at 3:30 to be fair to the next round of sessions. So let's begin without any ado. I'm not going to say anything more, and I'm going to start with Sanjeev Upreti. Sanjeev, you have 15 minutes in all. I don't know how this works and which sequence, but
can you remind me at 12
after 12, but this has gone off. How do you do? Please. Thank you, Sanjeev. Please begin your presentation.
My name is Sanjeev Upreti, and since time is of essence, I will just skip all the niceties and just go to the paper. My title is Masculinities and Violence, Social Norm, Social Structure and Law. This is part of a research I did for UNDP Nepal, which was supported by UNDP Nepal, and
so can you do something?
With the presentation?
I don't know how to fix it. Michael, can you?
Just have to put it on full.
All right.
So then use the arrow.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. On this one. Okay. So this was the research I had done for UNDP Nepal and Men Engaged. They jointly supported it, and the basically what we found was there were a number of reasons why these violences happen and the way they are related to masculinity. One is men occupy higher positions in the structure of power, which is the question of structure, which I'll come to it later, and then the socialization process of the social norms that is shaping the subjectivities of men, and then of course there is there is this association between aggressivity and dominance, that real man or real mother should be aggressive, dominant, so it's okay to commit violence, and then there is the question of law also. Very few women have access to law, or law is there, but when the implementation part comes, they are kind of not privileged. Methodology, we did 100 respondents from various sectors: men in police custody, students, graduate students, TG, teachers, LGBTI community. We included both men and women and transgender in this research, and we also did 10 audio interviews, and of which 6 were in-depth life history interviews and 4 more interviews with experts. And one thing was, there was a huge gap between the awareness of law and the actual gender. There were a lot of contradictions we found actually. At one hand, men we interviewed, they were aware of the law. This is illegal to do. You cannot beat up your wife, or you cannot have sex with her without her consent. But at the same time, they were still practicing it. So awareness of law, but still, breaking the law. And then some people, were in certain aspects of their life, they were very gender equitable behavior. I help my wife with kitchen work and etc. But at the same time, they carry very traditional stereotypes in their minds that men should be aggressive and all that. And there were some very liberal men, but who were doing very little work at home. So that traditional gender division of labor persisted in the households. And then since it's a big 100-page report, I can't go into that. I will just talk about some life histories. I interviewed a person called Vijay Rayamaji, who lives in Kathmandu. He's 54 years of age, middle class, Kshatriya caste, etc. He grew up in a very patriarchal family where there was a great expectation on young men, not that much expectation on the young woman and all that. And he's he's also a part-time television actor. He's unemployed for most of his life. He has 2 children, and when I started talking to them, he's displaying a lot of gender equitable behavior, very liberal in some cases. He does domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, helping in their homework, does not believe in beating the children, thinks child marriage and dowry systems are wrong, etc. He's also fine with his daughter having premarital sex as long as he does it secretly and safely, even though it might bring disrepute to the family. And then I started asking questions. So far the picture that was emerging was that of a very liberal person who makes financial decisions in your house. He says, we do it together. I don't have any job. His wife is the main breadwinner. He doesn't work. She has regular income, so she makes most of the economic decisions. But in some cases, I also make decisions. Do you help in the household duties? I help her fully in the domestic work. I help in cooking, washing, and cleaning. Who used to look after children's education when they were young? Mostly me. So he was looking after the children, etc. He's doing it. He's appearing very liberal. Then I came to this question: can men and women be equal? Are they equal? Then he says it's not possible. Not according to the nature. Their bodies are different, etc. Women have less physical ability than men. Even their mental abilities are less. But when you take various nations, from sports to politics, music, science, in all domains, it is mostly men. This is because nature has men more powerful than women. So I started seeing the contradictions. This contradiction part was very important for me, and throughout this entire research. Then he says, then I asked, why do you think men are less, intelligent than women, or they have less mental abilities? Then he says, their memory power is less than that of men. Even in the fields in which memory plays crucial role, it is men who mostly lead. Women have less reasoning and logical power. And then he talks, it is difficult for a woman to think deeply about any subject. Mozart, Beethoven, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, they were all men. All this shows that nature has men one bigger than men. Then he started asking other questions. It started because it was a life history interview. Have you had quarrels with your wife over the 25 years? He says, any blows? He said, no blows, even a single time. But we have some minor quarrels. What type of quarrels? Who starts it? Then he says, usually I do. Mostly it's about minor matters regarding food, household, etc. Simple things like one should not put the flask containing milk upside down without first washing it properly. If milk keeps on dripping, ants will come. So these are the kind of small things they used to fight about. And then, but then I asked, does she quarrel with you? He says, not these days. Because I stopped drinking since last year. But before that, when I was still drinking every day, she used to begin quarreling with me. Later, when she came to know about my extramarital affairs, then too she quarreled. Then I asked, how many extramarital affairs he had? He said 4 so far. But I have only one extramarital at one time. And then, so he started talking about the women and all that. And then he says, currently I am thinking of having another affair, but I don't have money for it. If you have an affair, you should take the women around, make them see places. We should not only think of how to get favors from them, we should also give them something in return. I cannot give them money, so I try to take them to the places they have not visited. And you need to feed them well during the trips too. This is my dharma. So this is the kind of, to do it very, very frankly. I am not speaking from some kind of a moral perspective. People do have affairs. This has continued. People have problems. I can understand. What was problematic for me was his utter lack of sensitivity. For him, it was a kind of a very natural thing, because he's a man. He's supposed to have these affairs, because men are born polygamous with nature. So this is the persistence of social norms, is what I would say. That was one of the elements of the thing. And then I interviewed just one more sample. Interviewed another person called Chandra Nagarputi, 25 years of age. He was charged of raping a waitress from a dance restaurant in which he also works as a waiter. So when I met him, he was in this Hanuman Doka prison with his high hands tied like this. He started talking with them. So he's coming from a very poor family, and then he had to leave his education at grade 3, and then start working in a restaurant, and then he married a woman, but she left him and migrated. The question of migration also comes into being, as we were discussing in the previous session, how migration is affecting masculinities. I won't go into that now. But his wife migrated to Kuwait or some Middle Eastern country, and then he was alone, but he takes care of this 9-year-old girl. He cooks for her. He washes her clothes. So very liberal, in a certain ways. So he really loves his daughter, and his daughter lives with him. Then, he started having, then this girl came to his restaurant. She's as a dancer, as a dancer in that restaurant, and then, she had just come from the village, so didn't know about the city. And one day she sent me an SMS saying that, did you have you taken your lunch? I thought he said that she's interested in me. And then one day the minibus that is supposed to take them to this restaurant did not come. She said, how will I go? He said, come to my apartment, we'll go together. She came, we started talking, and then he says, he said, after that sometime I lost control and tried to touch her. You should realize that I had been living without my wife for more than a year. She kept saying no in the beginning, but then got excited later and did not protest, and so we had sex with mutual consent. After the act, she was behaving normally, and we took the public transport together to reach the restaurant. I sat in the hall and she disappeared behind. After some time, they called me to the kitchen where she was sitting with the other girls in the restaurant, weeping and accusing me of raping her. And then he was taken to the police station, and that's where I am, he says. And then he said, how could I have raped her? If I had really tried to rape her, she could have shouted, which she never did, etc. You need at least 3 or 4 men to rape a girl. One is to hold her hands, another must put his palm on her mouth, etc. And then I asked, the reason she did not shout, was she scared of you? Isn't it possible that she did not cry out because she was scared? Then long pause, no answer. He does not answer that question. Then I said, is woman's no always a no? How is one to find out? What do you think? I asked him. Then he says, if a girl likes you, she might say yes immediately when you propose. Some of them say no at the beginning, but then they agree. But if you persist and keep on exciting her by playing with her body, some of them might take even 2-3 months to agree and want to fall in love before having sex. And then finally, all these ads, a lot of interviews we had. I won't go into that. Just 2 samples I talked about. I see this nexus of law, social norms, and social structure. Together, they combine each other to relate masculinities with this kind of violence. Law, because in Nepal there have been some positive changes in the law in the recent years. Domestic rape law, property law, constitutional provision for 33% women representing in CA, etc. Some positive laws have come, but still men and women in some ways are not equal in the eyes of law. First of all, many people have limited knowledge of law. Chandra, for example, the second person I talked about, he thought that this much will be tolerated. If I like this girl, I'm not beating her or anything. She's in my apartment. If I just play, if she gets excited, whatever, like this won't be repeated. So this much will. So there's very like a hazy area between law and convention. Certain conventions are coming, and there is law, and that middle space is a very tricky space. He was kind of operating within that middle space, and within that middle space of uncertainty, gender insensitive behavior continues as a bad habit. And then there is the slowness of the legal process, and this is the aspect of law. Then the second aspect is the social norms. Persistence of the patriarchal social norms, as we saw in the case of that Vijay whom I interviewed, who had affairs, all those affairs. He thought that he was entitled to do that. He said that he has a good relationship with his wife. He loves her, no problems in the marital life. But just because he's a man, he's supposed to have that affair. So this kind of persistence of this kind of social norms. The second thing, and the third thing is like question of social structure. Structure meaning, I mean public institutions like military, police, parliament, even like especially the institutions that are involved in the implementation of the law, making and the like practice of law, like courts, etc. And where there are very limited women in those institutions. So this creates a problem. And if woman is suffering rape, for example, when he goes to meet those people, even in the police station, see what she meets is men who will ask them very intimate detail, how you were raped, what you were wearing. So it's very difficult for them to say, okay, this is what happened. Very limited presence of women, but then the research also showed that it is not only men, but also women and transgender people who internalize these patriarchal ideologies, norms rather. So there were like a number of women and transgender people also saying that okay, men are born with leadership capability, men are born aggressive, etc. I'm about to finish. So this kind of idea, so people carry. So first of all, there is this question of law, and then there is the question of social norms, and there is the question of structure in which, so first of all, either there are very little women, very few women, and even if women are there, or if you put transgender people, they also might be coming with the same, ideological mindset, or after internalizing the same social norms. So how to bring the change? That becomes the problem. So what I see is that there is an intimate linkage between these three aspects, social structure, social norms, and law. Like for example, I will give you an example. The example is that like during the interviews, questionnaire interview, what is the defining ability of masculinity, defining characteristic of masculinity? Many people, including women and transgender, they said that men are born with leadership ability. This is the aspect of norm, because they are born with that norm. They believe that like men have leadership quality, but at the same time, that norm is supported by structure. Structure meaning, if you look at our parliament, like 28% are women now. Before that, there was even less. So when you look at the parliament, there is a visible spectacle. Let's say you can see that men are in the leadership position. You can see that in the television. You will see all male leaders. So that visible presence of men, which is the question of structure, reinforces that social norm.
Okay, you conclude now. You have a minute and a half.
Okay, and then so at one hand, but on the other hand, like this relationship is like intertwined. So in the same way, when people question, there should be why there are more, why there aren't more women in the parliament, then people have this social norm that because men have this leadership quality, so there is no problem if there are less women. So in other words, social structure and social norm, they mutually support and reinforce each other, and these two things together, they also shape the making and practice of law. Because that's why, law might be neutral, but as a legal practitioner told me, it's almost as if law is masculine, or the space in which law is practiced, that's masculine, because in that the structure is very, there are more men in the structure, and those women or men, whoever, they have the same patriarchal ideology. So to conclude, actually, if we want to how to solve these things, so to my mind, these are kind of a three-headed hydra. You have to cut three heads at the same time. If you just look at the social norms and don't look at the institutions and the structure, it will bring change. I don't say it's not bringing, it will bring change, but that change will be temporary if the structure remains the same. So I think these three aspects, law, structure, like norms, these three things should be dealt with simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you. before I call the next speaker, I just want to reflect on 2 points that you might want to pick up. Is the definition of what is consensus in anti-rape laws, because that's something we've recently achieved. Otherwise, it's left to social interpretation and gendered norms that we inherit as part of our everyday life. And the second point that I think is a raging issue across the sub-region is the issue of patriarchy and accountability of institutions and their ability to reform within themselves rather than only see it as an issue of the other, of the poor, of the uneducated, etc. Thank you. May I call my next speaker, please? Noor, the floor is all yours. Thank you. To remind everybody, his presentation is towards pro-feminist politics, study of men's movement for ending violence against women in Indonesia. So we will have a title there. That's ready to go. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sanita, for the time, and thank you for all of you for joining our discussion this afternoon. Today, I would like to share my research about men's movement to end violence against women in Indonesia. This research actually is part of my master program in the University of Wollongong, and I do this research under the supervision of Michael Flood. So here I would like to thank Michael for supervising me in doing this research. And the title of my presentation this afternoon is, I made a little bit change. How far can men go? A study of men's movement to end violence against women in Indonesia.
Very fast.
Let me start with giving you a brief context of this research. In the last 10 years, there has been a growing of a men's movement to end violence against women in Indonesia. This phenomenon started to emerge at the end of 1990s, when there was a group of men in Jakarta declared its opposition to men's violence against women. And this phenomenon strengthened right after the first global symposium in Brazil at the end of 2009, when there was some male activists and feminists gathered in Bandung to initiate a national men network to end violence against women in Indonesia. This group is called Aliansi Laki-Laki Baru, or in English it means the New Men's Alliance. However, while men's movement is growing, there are concerns among feminists in Indonesia about the dangers or the risks of men's involvement in the women's movement. One feminist insists that the men's engagement in the women movement is one step to the new domination of men of a woman within women movement. She also argues that the presence of men in women movement may create an ideological battle between men's group and women's group, and in which women's group may lose the battle for the fact that Indonesian society still in favor the interest of male. And these concerns arise because Indonesian feminists witness some male activist inconsistency who initially support feminist movement, but at the end they commit action against feminist values and principles. So the question is, does the men's alliance or the men's network really strengthen the women movement or the movement to end violence against women? So this is actually the main questions of my research. So, and to answer these questions, this research study the Aliansi Laki-Laki Baru, one of men's group in Indonesia, by looking at 3 dimensions of the alliance. First, ideology. Second, organizational structure and practices. And the last, the impact. Why this research focus on those 3 dimensions? Because this research assumes to be pro-feminist men's group or to enable men's group strengthen women's movement, it must first believe or agree with feminist values, incorporate feminist principle into its organizational structure and practices, and then the third, generate positive impact for the achievement of feminist agenda, among other elimination of violence against women. So to get the data, this research applies 3 research methods that are commonly used in qualitative research. First, a document study, focus group discussion, and interview with the key members of the New Men's Alliance. Now I would like to share some key findings of my research. Let me start with the first dimension, the compatibility of the New Men Alliance belief with feminist values. This research found that the alliance clearly declared that it was born from the womb of feminism. This claim supported by the fact that all the participants of this research has a close connection with feminist groups in Indonesia, such as being students of feminist lecturer, being a research assistant of feminist researcher, being friends of feminists, and being staff members of the feminist organizations. This research also finds that the alliance identifies itself as a pro-feminist, as indicated by the alliance agreement to some feminist standpoint, such as personal is political, and then blaming patriarchy for constructing the structure of dominance, and believe that violence against women is a consequence of imbalanced power relation between men and women, and also the emphasis on the accountability and responsibility of men for their use of violence. And then regarding the commitment to incorporate feminist principle, this research found the strong commitment of the alliance to incorporate feminist values principle into its organizational structure. The first, by keeping the alliance attached to feminist organizations. So this attachment become a foundation of the alliance in building partnership and accountability for feminist groups in Indonesia. And then the alliance also identifies itself as a collectivist, non-formal, inclusive, and voluntary type of organizations. So this is some data regarding the commitment of the alliance in incorporating feminist principle into its organizational structure and principle. And another another finding is considering that the alliance believes that violence against women is not only individual or personal problem, but structural as well as structural problem. The alliance perceives that changing individual members and men in general is important as changing new norms and also policies underpin violence against women. And then the third dimension is the impact of the New Men's Alliance movement. This research found that the alliance have made a meaningful change in its members, in which the alliance perceives that the commitment to feminist values is a long life commitment, and also the alliance have shifted the issue of men and masculinity from the margin to the center of violence against women discourse in Indonesia. And then the alliance also able to create or establish a virtual community that oppose men violence against women, and also increasing number of men who take action to challenge patriarchy and men's violence against women, even though the number remains small compared to the total population of men in Indonesia. And then the alliance is also able to generate new resources for feminist groups, because as I said, that the alliance create consultative groups. So the alliance is not running the program, but all the programs regarding engaging men and boys are organized by feminist groups, the member of the consultative group of the New Men Alliance. And then another impact is the availability of new policies on prevention of violence against women at local and national level. Although this is quite difficult whether these policies as a result of the New Men's Alliance, because there are so many actors in this issue, but at least the alliance influence the production of those new policies. At least there are 2 districts in Indonesia that produce new policies on protection of women from violence against women, and also there is a new policy in the Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection. Just recently, the ministry published the manual on engaging men and boys to end violence against women in Indonesia. So that is the regarding the impact. But however, the alliance have also encountered many challenges. The first is on how to sustain feminist principles to its members. Yes, and then how the alliance ensure equal participation among members in organizational processes, and then ensuring accountability for diverse feminist group in Indonesia, because only about 5 feminist groups who involved in the consultative group. So and there are diverse feminist group actually. So the 5 feminist organization is not really represents the feminist movement in Indonesia. And then the last challenge is anticipating the negative consequence of new policies regarding engaging men and boys in anti-violence against women advocacy, because this issue have been raised by feminists after the Ministry of Women Empowerment and Child Protection released the manual on engaging men and boys in ending violence against women in Indonesia. To conclude, I would like to overall that although there are some challenges encountered by the New Men Alliance, this research concludes that ideologically the New Men's Alliance can be considered pro-feminist and substantially pro-feminist in its organizational structure and practices, and also it generate positive impact for the movement for the elimination of violence against women in Indonesia. Therefore, this research considered that this alliance moderately strengthen the movement to end violence against women in Indonesia. And since the men's movement is growing globally, the need of evaluating the men's movement is crucial, and I consider this research as a preliminary research to develop a framework on evaluating men's movement. Thank you.
Wonderful presenters this afternoon that kept their time. I just want to make a comment for you to think about for your questions. One of the things that I have picked up is that we're not talking about parallel programming by the men's group. We're talking about strategic joint programming based on a common ideology. And I think that's a very important departure, because often what happens is you do parallel tracks and somewhere try to meet on activities rather than the larger perspective. Thank you. And may I now welcome Michael Flood, his work with men to end violence against women in terms of critical assessment and future directions from the University of Australia. Wollongong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And look, it's a real pleasure and an honour to be at this symposium at all. Actually, I found it a pretty amazing and inspiring and humbling few days, actually, in terms of just how much I don't know. In fact, so it's been really fascinating for me. And I wrote to a friend back in Australia, I'd found my people. I very much, so it's been lovely to be here. And look, it's particularly nice to follow Noor. I find his research really inspiring. I think it's a great example of the intersections of research and advocacy, and so particularly pleased to follow Noor. So this presentation is a critical stocktake of efforts to involve men in the prevention of violence against women, but it does have a wider significance for other kinds of efforts engaging men in other dimensions of gender. And what I'll do in this presentation is critically assess some assumptions which I think are becoming increasingly dominant in the field. They may be particularly dominant in North America and other high-income, rich Western countries. I'm not sure how dominant they are internationally, but they certainly seem present. And actually, before I get to that, I've long been a cheerleader for this work. I've long said, we have to involve men in prevention, but I'm not going to stop saying that, but I want to do something different today, a critical assessment. And this is certainly an exploding field, and with James Lang and Rachel Jukes, wherever she's gone, we have a piece coming out in The Lancet about this field, and one of the things we do is map the kind of range of work that's being done. And so this is just a diagram from that Lancet piece to be released next week. But I'm going to do three things. I'm going to critically assess this field in terms of its relations with feminism, its understandings of men, gender and violence, and its approach to engaging men. So, from the beginnings of this work, some feminists have expressed concern about its practice and its politics. To what extent have these concerns been realised? One concern is about money. I don't know of many examples where violence prevention work with men has directly taken funding away from work with women. I'd be interested to hear if you know of such examples, but there certainly are tensions between efforts to engage men and boys and work with women and girls. Some people have expressed concern that men might take over campaigns, violence prevention campaigns. My experience more is not that men take over, it's that men don't turn up. Men aren't there at all. It's in fact women doing the bulk of the work. But certainly it's true that sometimes there are instances where men dominate interactions, where men claim unearned expertise, where men act in other patriarchal ways. And there's a kind of glass escalator effect where men in this female-dominated field may rise to the top more quickly than women, be given status and power that women are not. Others have asked about collaboration, and in fact internationally from the data we've got, much of this work is actually done by women's organisations. Much of the work engaging men is done by women's and violence-related organisations. But in North America, that's where the kind of men-focused organisations are particularly prominent, but they're also prominent elsewhere. And so most of this work does involve some level of collaboration, but may not involve, though, effective partnership. It may still dilute feminist efforts. I should say this paper is a condensed version, a 14-minute condensed version, of a journal article that hopefully will come out in the journal Culture, Health and Sexuality, a critical issue on engaging men. So a bit more on relations with feminism. Actually, I've said that about collaboration. I certainly think, I think that this emphasis on engaging men in building gender equality and ending violence against women, it's a feminist achievement. I think it's a feminist achievement, but it may have also diminished recognition of the need for women-focused and women-only programs. It may have fueled the idea that we have to have men everywhere. Men have to be in every program, in every room, and that's certainly dangerous. So that's the first bit, relations with feminism. Second bit is about its understandings, typical understandings in the field, and I think there are three kinds of weaknesses. One is a focus on attitudes. We've heard, a little bit at this conference about structural inequalities and the way in which men's violence against women is driven by structural, material, collective inequalities. But a focus on attitudes and norms still dominates the field, and those inequalities are neglected in that focus. Equally, changing attitudes doesn't necessarily change behaviour, and the relationship between them is complex and two-way. Violence prevention efforts with men often draw on the public health approach, the public health approach that the WHO has popularised, and there are tensions between that and feminist approaches. A second issue is which men, and men and boys in this work, I think, often are treated in a homogenous way, as if we are all the same, whereas feminist work emphasises the intersections of gender, with race and class and ethnicity and disability and age and so on. And there's been very little direct assessment of the value of kind of culturally specific interventions which build on local knowledge and culture and are tailored to specific populations. In fact, I know of only one study that compared a kind of culturally relevant intervention with a colour-blind, a kind of race and ethnicity blind intervention, and surprise, surprise, the latter was much more effective. The former was much more effective. There's another problem here, that often we find ourselves asking deeply disadvantaged men to address their own power and privilege, men who in some ways may not have power and privilege. And we ask disadvantaged and marginalised men to somehow be agents of social change. There's an issue there. And I think it's also true that much of this work neglects gay and queer men and transgender people. It often addresses men as homogeneously heterosexual. It assumes that all of us, for example, have women in our lives about whom we care. There's another problem about the way we talk about violence in this field, that there's a treatment of violence as homogenous. Whereas if you look at the research on domestic and family violence, it's starting to talk about different patterns of violence in couples which demand different explanations and different responses. There's some other things too, and these may be, I'm not sure how common these are globally, they're certainly visible in much of the violence prevention work with men. One is a kind of constant focus on masculinity. The problem is masculinity. We have to change masculinity. We have to transform masculinity. And I agree with that in a sense, but it can mean that we kind of distance actual men and men's practices and men's identities from the problems of sexism and violence. We fail to pay attention to men and men's material practices. Another is an emphasis sometimes in this field on two types of men. There's the good men, the well-meaning men, the men like me, the men of courage, the men of conscience, and then there's those other bad men who do violence. And that's comforting but profoundly misleading. A focus only on the obvious forms of violence. I've never held a knife to a woman's throat. I've never left a woman with a black eye. And that can mean we miss the other kinds of sexism and coercive behaviour that many of us practice. In fact, it's often said in the violence prevention field, most men are not violent. Well, there's some countries where that's clearly untrue, in fact. And in fact, in many countries, many men, men like me, other men, perform various more subtle forms of coercion and violence. Okay, so that's my quick critique of some of the understandings in this field. Third is I want to complicate some mantras, some taken for granted assumptions that are part of the kind of engaging men field. These are assumptions that have shaky evidence or have dangerous effects or should be at least said more carefully. And the first one is about whether this stuff works. There's often a kind of confidence, a complacency. Our interventions work. It works to engage men. And the fact is, most interventions around the world have not been evaluated. When they are evaluated, often the evaluation is poor methodologically or poor conceptually. There is some evidence that interventions work, and the piece that James Lang and Rachel Jukes and I have in The Lancet, it reviews some of that research. It mentions the 3 reviews of published studies among men and boys that have come out. And it does show that if they're designed well, and that should be a very big if they're designed well, interventions can shift attitudes of behaviours. But it's not a big body of evidence. So Ricardo et al., 2011, Ricardo and her colleagues, they reviewed 65 studies. Only 7 with strong or moderate research design showed an impact on the perpetration of non-sexual violence, and only 1 of the well-designed studies showed an impact on sexual violence. So it's not, we can't quite rest on what we've done so far. A second mantra, a second common assumption in this field is that men will benefit. It's in men's interests. And I've certainly said this. I've said this myself, that men will benefit from progress towards gender equality and non-violence. But if that's all we say, if we only focus on the benefits to men, that's dangerous. It's dangerous, first of all, because the men who use violence benefit from that. They get the pleasures, the joys of an obedient, deferent, subservient partner who will sexually service them, who'll do the domestic work, who follow their wishes. And in fact, men in general benefit. All men in this room, all men on this planet benefit from the violence that some men do. We benefit because violence limits women's autonomy, their safety, their participation in political decision-making, and so we get the room. We get to have the boardrooms and the street and so on. And so there's a sense in which men will lose. Men will lose from progress towards gender equality and non-violence. And we have to acknowledge the costs to men of challenging the patriarchal privileges that feed into violence. We have to also acknowledge the costs of participating in violence prevention itself. The men and boys who come along, who participate, who become advocates, who wear those gender activist T-shirts that I really want one of, please. They may be hassled for their non-conformity to gender norms. They may be homophobically harassed and so on. So there are costs. But I'm not saying we should only appeal to men on the basis of ethics or altruism. They're important appeals. It's the right thing to do to end violence against women. But we should also appeal to men's sense of reconstructed self-interest, of reconstructed or anti-patriarchal self-interest. A third assumption is that the best people to work with men are men. And there's two parts to this, an emphasis on all male groups and an emphasis on male educators. The actual evidence about single-sex groups, all male groups versus mixed-sex groups, is actually much more mixed. And there's some studies that show that men change more in mixed-sex groups than they do in single-sex groups. And it depends what you're doing. It depends on the focus and goals of the teaching session, the kinds of teaching methods you're using, and so on. And it can be very, very powerful for men to listen to women. What about male educators? There is evidence, and this is depressing evidence, that men do listen more readily to other men. People have done experiments where you get the same lecture, you give it to a man and a woman, and they each give the same lecture to classes, matched classes. And the man's lecture, he had some important points to make. He had something sensible to say. The woman's lecture, bloody man-haters, feminazi, lesbian, she's judged much more negatively. And so strategically, we might put men in front of the room so that men shut down less. Men are less defensive. But there's also evidence that men often come to this issue of violence against women, of gender equality, from listening to women, from hearing women's experiences of violence and abuse and so on. So we have to somehow balance those. Another common practice, particularly in North America, is the use of real men. So, posters to men or advertising to men that uses male sporting heroes or male celebrities. And they're the bell cows. The cow that wears the bell makes a noise and the other cows follow along. They're the bell cows of this movement, and men will follow them because of their conformity to gender norms. But if we rely only on men who conform to most gender norms, we may limit social change. And that's because those rigid gender codes, the policing of manhood, is itself part of the problem. We should also affirm and celebrate those men who don't fit dominant codes of masculinity. Girly men, gay men, sissy men, transgender men, and so on. We should break down narrow constructions of manhood and gender binaries, and we should turn up the volume. We should turn up the volume on the actual sexual and gender diversity among men, including among heterosexual men, including the actual diversity among heterosexual men themselves. A fourth mantra is that our goal is to build new masculinities, create new positive masculinities. And some campaigns appeal to real men. The campaign on the left is from Australia, the campaign on the right from the US. So some campaigns talk about real men. Other campaigns appeal to stereotypically masculine qualities, like strength or courage. My strength is not for hurting, or I'm a man who stands up, those kinds of things. And there's an obvious logic here. Let's change the socially produced links between violence and masculinity. It makes sense. But there's other ways, in fact, in which we should encourage men to abandon masculinity altogether, to disinvest, to pull out, to boycott, to not only to challenge the meanings we give to manhood, but actually to challenge men's investments in being men altogether, to challenge the gender binaries and the policing of gender. Final thing. Another assumption is that the best way to change men is to work with men, and there's some ways in which, in fact, we will change men more effectively by ignoring them and working with women. And what I'm drawing on here is the research on empowering women. And so the research not only on empowering women, but also the research on shifting the wider conditions within which men make choices about how they will treat the women in their lives. So one thing we can do is shift women's expectations of men, increase the pressure on men, the incentives for men to be gender equitable and non-violent, because otherwise they'll be single, they'll be lonely and sexless and so on. So in other words, harness men's motivations to be liked by women. Yes, that's unfair to women, but it's no more unfair than unfair gender relations. We also need to change structural conditions and circumstances. We need strategies of economic and political empowerment for women. We need strategies which decrease women's dependence on men. We need strategies which change law and policy. Again, to change the conditions within which men make choices, to force men to change, in other words. So, engaging men is very much on the agenda. It's a routine element now in violence prevention and other efforts around the world. It's a feminist achievement. It embodies the fundamental recognition that men's violence against women is a problem overwhelmingly for which men are responsible and which men must join with women to address. But we cannot risk the kind of uncritical adoption of some taken for granted truths which are inaccurate or dangerous or simplistic. We need a critical assessment of this field. That's my 15 minutes. We need a critical assessment of this field if we are to make progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Can I take this?
I really take the message you've given several times for your presentation, that engaging men is a feminist achievement. I think we've been working pretty hard on it. Thank you. We now have those of you who come late, David Abbott, servant from the Columbia University, and he's going to talk about dissent in governance in the 2012-2013 anti-sexual violence protests that took place in India.
Okay, great. Let me just get organized. Okay, hi. So I'm just gonna get started because I don't think that I have very much time. So I'm talking about something that happened down the street from here a year ago. I'm talking about a year and a half, 2 years around, whatever. It started out on December 16th, 2012, when a woman was raped in South Delhi. And what I want to look at is the process that happened between when this woman was raped and legislation was passed about 3 months later. I'm interested in kind of looking at the structures of domination and power, and what are the mechanics of power that have led to this legislation, what this legislation actually does. So I'm not going to dwell very much on like the incident itself or the protests, right? There were these protests that erupted after this incident, kind of the biggest ones happening around the 22nd of December, but continuing on for months and months after that. And there was also this opening up of discursive space throughout India and throughout the world on sexual violence and kind of breaking the silence around that. So these protests were the reaction to this violence, right? Among these, there are leading voices that emerge, including one who's in the room with us today, Sunita Dhar, but also others that have been at this conference. The key activist that I look at in my research is Kavita Krishnan, who was also here. And so this is from a reflection that she wrote about a year after the movement, right? And she said, as the movement progressed, the slogan of freedom without fear, Bekhaf Azadi, was embraced by others beyond women. The right of the protester at the barricades, the Muslim, the Kashmiri, the woman or the man from the northeast, the working class, slum-dwelling man or woman, the sex worker, came to be asserted with the right of every woman to access the streets and public spaces freely without fearing violence, without being seen as suspicious. So rights, from the very beginning, this discourse of rights was very important for the women's movement, and has been important for, as I will show, for many years. So I think Kavita is kind of like the activist voice here, right? Kind of representative of that leftist activist voice. Vrinda Grover, who spoke this morning, I see her as the legislative voice, the leftist legislative voice. And in a conference that included Sunita on February in 2013, and Madhu Mehra and a number of other people, Kavita Krishnan also, Vrinda said, the Justice Verma Committee did path-breaking work primarily because it wrote the issue of sexual violence in the right of equality, freedom, and dignity. So again, rights is an important part in the leftist legislative discourse. And then Nivedita Menon I see as the academic voice of the left. She also spoke here at this conference. And one of the things she wrote, this is from a statement by women's and progressive groups and individuals condemning sexual violence and opposing the death penalty a few months after this incident, or I think it was a few weeks after this incident happened. In December, so a few days. One of the first statements, the first statement that came out. She said, this is just an expert of it. We, the undersigned, demand the following: greater dignity, equality, autonomy, and rights for women and girls, from a society that should stop questioning policing the actions at every step. So this is kind of what I want to do, is kind of interrogate this rights discourse, right? What is our discourse, our reliance on rights actually doing? What is the work that this discourse does in either ending or perpetuating sexual violence? So what happens after this, right? After only a few days, it only took the government a few days to start responding. On December 23rd, the Ministry of Home Affairs issued notification number SO 3003E, which this is an excerpt of it also. In the light of the recent incident, the government have given the anxious consideration to the need for reviewing the present laws so as to provide for speedier justice and enhanced punishment. In cases of aggravated sexual assault, in order to give recommendations to the above, it has been decided by the Union government to constitute a committee of eminent jurists to look into possible amendments of the criminal law so as to provide for quicker trial and enhanced punishment for criminals. So what we see here is the creation of the Justice Verma Committee, which Vrinda Grover spoke about this morning, which was headed by an ex-Supreme Court Justice of India, J.S. Verma. Who are the people who is the government that is issuing these notifications, right? The people that were seen as in charge of creating the Justice Verma Commission and that were kind of in charge of its development was the Ministry of the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is the same ministry that is involved in internal security. So they're the same people that are managing the communists in the east of India, right? The communist threat by the Naxalites. Ministry of Home Affairs. The same people that are dealing with the terrorists in Kashmir, the Ministry of Home Affairs. Rapid Action Forces, policing, all of these things come from this same ministry. So this same ministry that is in charge of internal pacification and control is the same ministry that is then creating a response to the rights discourse, right? A way in which they're going to take the discourse that activists have been using and then use it for their own ends. So this committee made these the J.S. Verma committee was formed, made a number of recommendations. It was actually a pretty amazing commission. It was kind of like very broad-ranging, a 500-page report, this massive report in 30 days that included a lot of the women's movement, voices from the women's movement. But what I want to argue is that this report, actually what happens, okay, let me leave the analysis towards the very end. So this report is written, and then there's the criminal law amendment ordinance is passed in, I think it's where do I have it here? April, and then only a few days later the Criminal Law Amendment Act. So it's first the ordinance and then the acts, right, that are passed. 106 days after the initial incident happens. When then the Criminal Law Amendment Act is a lot of women's organizations said that it called it an eyewash ordinance. In other words, that there weren't many recommendations from the Justice Verma Committee. Few of what the women's movement groups wanted to be in the final law was actually in that law. So then there were protests that re-engaged the state again, that re-engaged this demand for law, and including APWA, which is Kavita Krishna's organization, the All India Progressive Women's Association, had a number of protests, and among these are some of the slogans were, "Are our lawmakers ready to listen to the voice of the movement against sexual violence?" So our lawmakers, right? "No to government eyewash ordinance. implement Justice Verma recommendations against sexual violence. So now I want to come to the analysis of this. What I argue that the Justice Verma Committee is a gift from the government to the kind of civil society, right? I take Jacques Derrida's idea of a gift, that a gift is something that you give in order to have, that there's a kind of reciprocal relationship where you give something and then there's some expectation of giving in return. So the gift of the Justice Verma Commission then is that, and then of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, is that civil society should be happy about the changes that the government has brought about, right? That we have given you what you asked for, so now we're kind of like devoid of any responsibility or accountability. But then what actually happens is that it causes a re-engagement with the state. So it's this continuous, it's first the rights narrative, and then the Justice Verma Commission, and then the criminal law ordinance, and then more protests. So it's kind of this cyclical process that is happening, that is forcing women's movements to re-engage with the state and then fetishize the state as the site of responsibility for sexual violence. Brenda Grover said something about accountability this morning, that we want to hold the state accountable, which might be the intentions of what is happening, but I see this as responsibilizing the state, that the state is the one that ensures the protection of women in this country, and I think around the world. You can make similar, you can reach similar conclusions. So my issue with the rights, with the project of human rights, is I take from Wendy Brown's critique of rights also, and to use her words, it says the rights project displaces, competes with, refuses, or rejects other political projects, and as such becomes not a tactic, but a particular form of political power carrying a particular image of justice. In other words, the rights narrative requires only an engagement with the state, that our political imaginaries are kind of atrophied after that, because we cannot engage, we cannot think of other kind of solutions to sexual violence that are very, very concrete and wide-ranging outside of our demands on the state. So I think that this narrative of rights then can be used to. I think that I don't want to come here and like crush all of the amazing work that Sunita and her colleagues have done. I think that the work that there is a chance for legislation and rights, and this narrative of rights, to be used to defend against social and political power. But we also have to keep in mind that this tool must rely, by definition, the human rights must rely, and women's rights must rely on systems and structures that produce that power and domination that those systems that we're trying to fight against, right? So the narrative of rights then becomes an aspect of governmentality, a crucial aspect of power's aperture. They're not simply rules and defenses against power. They can themselves become tactics and vehicles of governance and domination. So then what I end up arguing is that the rights project doesn't empower subjects, but rather it reproduces and creates subjects. So in other words, the discourse of women's rights, by seeking to empower subjects through this kind of liberal individualist discourse, actually produces weakened subjects in need of protection which is then provided by mechanisms of the state and then carried out by that same violent state. I think that something else is happening. I still have a couple minutes. I promise. So what does this tell us? I think that there's kind of this arrival or this recreation of a fascist democratic state where dissent is reincorporated into the state, and through also the NGOization of civil society, that our political imaginaries are reincorporated into the state, and then reincorporated as this dissent that then takes the form of these kind of commissions, which, by the way, this isn't the first time this has happened. The women's rights movement has recognized that legislation has only limited ends to it, right, here in India. And this has happened, this exact same process happened in the past before. It happened in 1972 with, I think it was Maya Tyagi. I don't know where I put it. 1972, Maya Tyagi, and then in 1980 with the Mathura rape case. I might be flipping those dates around. I'm not sure. But there was a similar thing that happened. There was this protest, and then there was the state created these commissions, and then there were protests that the state had not had not reached kind of like what we wanted it to do. So what can we do? I kind of like this is definitely a very not well thought through, and this is just kind of like a way. I just think that I should end on kind of a hopeful note that we can have some kind of that there are alternatives to the state and state mechanisms that are happening today, right? So I call this a materialist or a militant feminist politics, and I include there are a number of places around the world that this has been happening. Here in Uttar Pradesh, there's the Gulabi gang, right, that uses force to make men accountable for the violence that they're perpetuating, and the government also. The next one, so from right to left, the next one is the Oka crisis in Canada, which was when indigenous groups in Canada rose up against the government and with weapons, with arms, and said, you're not going to trespass on our land anymore. Not because of the rights that you've given us, but because this is our land. And the same with the Zapatista movement in Mexico, which is the last one, right? And so my argument is that violence, when you are doing violence onto a system of power and domination, that is not violence in itself. So I don't want to, I'm not someone to say that nonviolence is the only way forward, especially when there are people that have no economic power, no political power, no social power, that sometimes the only resort that we can have is violence. And I think that there needs to be kind of like a critical reassessment and re-engagement with the state, with broader systems of power, with capitalism, and that will, to create the kind of social conditions which make sexual violence impossible. I hope that made sense. Thank you.
Just one more correction, but we can have a conversation on this later, that it was not just the leftist movement, the mass-based organization from all shades of left, but it was the autonomous women's movement that basically led most of the process of change, and not as a response to December 12th, because if you examine all the papers and submissions that we had made to the government and the Ministry of Home and the Ministry of Law and the Prime Minister, they date back to 3 to 4 years ahead. So there's a history, her story, and the process that probably can be going to woven into your presentation. Now, let me hand over the floor to you all, please. Identify yourselves, 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Mbuyiselo Bota from South Africa. Michael, I thank for all of you, the wonderful paper presentation. I think, Mike, I have problems with, still problems with what you are searching. You are saying that it is always not true, and you have been very general to say that woman to woman. Look, Rachel, your colleague, my friend, will not go to Venda and speak to the chiefs in Venda. Look, it's a non-starter. That will not happen. They will not allow her. They will not even want to see her face. Now you have a choice, which is what always what face your choice. You say that here are 200 traditional leaders. Are you going to engage in a more organic type of persuasion, or you're going to say, well, if Rachel is not coming, we're not going to have this training. So I'm just saying, I would have expected to have course it differently, because situations would differ. But having said that, also the other colleague spoke of, maybe the first speaker, about, I would have wanted to hear you explaining and maybe extrapolating on the principles that informed the working, you spoke about working with men. What are those principles? What are those values? If you remember yesterday in the plenary, I raised the question about even men engaged, the leadership. I mean, I don't agree with a colleague of mine, with Dean and who's the other guy, the two, they're both male, and they're both friends of mine. I don't agree that you do not have a woman who is part of the men engaged leadership. So the question of leadership, for me, is central, it's critical. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the great presentation. I really I've been taking notes of that in terms of Hasim. I think the triangle about social norms, social structures, and law. Thank you for that. If you can provide further suggestions about how in terms of interventions, concrete intervention, how can we take these three legs and transform them, and working with men and boys on these three legs that I think are very, very well explained. I also would like to hear more about this proposal that Hashim was mentioning about developing evaluation models for the engaging men movement. If you can provide further thoughts about what is from your research, how can we use it for evaluating networks? Thinking about the men engaged network has many networking in different regions, so it could be very useful to use your what you are doing with your research in Indonesia. And regarding Michael, thanks for this critical reflection. I think they are very, very needed within men engaged in general. We are kind of using this common assumption that engaging men is the kind of the solution or is necessary in all projects. So I think what you are reminding us is very, very important. I really appreciate that, and I hope we can use your reflections, your analysis in men engaged in general. In some way, I can see a trend to try to push for this inclusive approach in a way that is understood as inclusive means that in every program, men should be part of, engaging men should be part, and I totally disagree as well. I think the spaces on which only working with women and girls are important, and as you were mentioning, empowering women has a profound impact in men, many times much more effective than trying to reach out to men directly. So I think all of your reflection I really would love. Not only in Lancet, the problem with Lancet is that it's a very limited outlet too. Yeah. So we need to transform, translate this reflection in other spaces, and also I thank again for this contribution that you are about to publish.
Thank you. May I just request you to be very brief so that we can have more voices?
Yes. My name is Srinivas. Sanjeev, I have a question, a rather inquiry, because during your case study presentation, you have spoken about the fact there is lack of knowledge of law in some of the cases that you presented. I think we need to revisit that analysis, because most of the time this lack of the knowledge of law phenomena works as a escape route, whereas if you see in most of the violence against women and all that, it is the mindset, it is that whole construct that plays a very important role rather than this lack of, because the heinous kind of crime and insensitivities are actually committed by a lot of men who have the best knowledge of law. So therefore we must always be very careful about this. So this is something which probably one need to revisit. And secondly, Noor, I really liked your presentation, and because I have had some association with Indonesia, so it's just an inquiry that in past few years we have also seen in Indonesia a lot of fundamentalist organizations who have sort of done so many things to suppress the women's movement. So it will be very interesting what was the men network, how they cope with that. I'm sure they must have also faced hardship in dealing with that along with the women's movement, which is in fact facing a lot of, in last 5 years there has been a lot of cases where the fundamentalist organization have really done something. So it would be interesting to know a bit more about that. So second and third and the last one, brief. Okay. David, I have a little bit of problem with one of your analysis where you say it's a gift by the state. It is perceived to be gift by the state, by that particular ministry. See, this is what has been also, sort of a notion which Britishers had. We are gifting something to the Indians whenever we go to the street. So, it has never been the gift. It has always been the, engaging, disengaging and re-engaging with the state. And it is a continuous political process. So one should also look beyond those, gift structures of the state.
Thank you. Very good questions. One more last question, and then I'll do a second round.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Michael. I mean, clarification. The theory of hegemonic masculinity has been used widely. We call it theory of hegemonic masculinity. You've given quite an update, and it's been criticized in the past. What do you think it is value currently in the analysis of the dynamic? What do you think its value currently in the analysis of the dynamics of masculinity? Thank you.
Okay. I'll just briefly turn to you to respond and then take a second round of questions. Thank you.
Should I do
Please.
Okay. Basically, three questions related towards me. First, I will go to what you asked about the law thing. By the research showed that, I mean, this is not the general kind of statement. Research showed that some respondents had lack of knowledge. And actually, we also did, because I could not bring the whole research because of the shortage of time, we had analyzed in terms of the various factors like class, education, etc. So what we found is that people in the lower economic class and who are having a very lower level of education, they are having less knowledge of law. I mean, that was one thing. Not all, but the percentage was more in their case compared to people who belong to middle classes and who had greater level of education. They are more knowledge of law, but it was also problematic, But in the case of that middle educated class, there was more of this hypocrisy, whatever, because they know the law and yet they commit the crime. Whereas in the lower level and educational classes, there was, in some cases, there was comparatively, I would say, there was less knowledge of law. That was the only thing I was trying to say. So it's not a general statement. So, but you have to look at from the various factors, is what I would say. Second question regarding what you said, I mean, what is the principle behind it? For me, the principle is world with gender justice, is what I would say. I mean, that's why I'm here. I believe in it passionately. Second thing, the question, as you rightly said, the question of leadership is crucial. And in this, as I said, that's why I thought the social structure is equally important, because we can change all the norms and all that, but as long as men continue to hold the positions of power and leadership in their structure, whatever changes the effect will only be temporary, or it will have minimal effects. So I think that's crucial part. That's what that was entirely my argument. And then another question is, how are we going to do it? It's a very complex thing, because as I said, it's a kind of because these three things, as I said, the metaphor I used was a kind of a three-headed hydra. If you cut one head, and another one comes up. Structure, norm, and law. So the battle has to be fought at these three fronts simultaneously. The problem with Nepal is that I saw that lot of NGO work, etc., is being geared towards changing of the norms, which is crucial, of course, because norms are so deep rooted in our minds that they affect the practices, they affect the way we think. So that is crucial. And law, of course, is crucial, because there have been some positive changes, and the entire lawyers and a lot of activists, legal activists, they are fighting for the changing of the law, and that's happening. That is true. But at the same time, we are not thinking enough about the structure, is what I think. Because in the structure, in law implementing agency, courts, legal systems, everywhere, in police, army, it is men who predominate. And that makes it very unfriendly spaces for women sometimes. So that needs to be addressed. Like, for example, I'll just stop, and then, in Nepal, there was the parliament passed a law that, 33% women should be represented in all the social bodies. That has not happened. The law was passed, that has not happened. And no one is speaking about it, writing about it. So I think, there should be a kind of affiliation of men, like-minded men, women, transgender, whoever. It's a kind of a watchdog, who should be constantly, that should be there, to pressure the government through media, etc. So it should be kind of a wider affiliation, is all I can say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oswaldo, the challenge in doing this research is developing the framework, because when we look at the feminist ideology, when I discuss with Michael, as we know that feminism is very diverse. So when we start developing the framework in determining what is the variables, which feminist stream that we are going to use. So as an evaluation research, so this process is very political, in which the values of the researcher is very influenced in developing the framework. So the framework is consists like the indicator lalu, and then the variables. For instance, for ideological dimension, we formulate the variables such as the belief that patriarchy shape rigid notion and practices of femininity and masculinity, and then violence against women is as a consequence of imbalanced power relation between men and women, and so on and so on. So we're developing the variables in the framework. But again, this is a very difficult one. But so this is also as a political as a politic in which as researcher we have to select. And then another challenge is when we're developing the criteria in each dimension and overall criteria is also the challenge. So as I said, that this is like a preliminary. So because for master program it's very short, so we really tight for the program. So I not intend to climb this framework as universal, but ongoing process. So that is the first response. And the second, yes, currently there is a strength. I mean, the fundamentalist groups in Indonesia is growing and even strengthened. So the group is also face challenge from them. For instance, some of activities that have done by this group when they wearing miniskirt in the center of the city of Jakarta to protest about the rape case. So many respond in one media and raising the issue of homophobia, accusing that this group is a gay man, want to legalize same marriage, and so on and so on. So this is also the risk that faced by this alliance in Indonesia. But luckily, recently most of the fundamentalist group focusing in our new president, so no more threat from them for the new alliance. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. We have limited time, so
your question. Look, I agree with you. I'm very pragmatic. The question I want to know is what will best advance progress towards gender equality and non-violence. So if his male chiefs in Venda will not listen to a woman, then send a man. I don't want to be righteous or kind of puritanical about this. But I suppose my critique has been that some of the ways in which we appeal to men and we invest in masculinity actually may slow our progress towards social change. That's all. But I very much agree with you. Hegemonic masculinity, is it a useful concept? I very much think it is. It's used in simplistic ways sometimes, and there's a tension. Does hegemonic masculinity refer to a kind of cultural ideal? What is thought of as what men should be in any context, or is it a political? Do we have a political definition of hegemonic masculinity, where hegemonic masculinity refers to the forms of gender practice which dominate women? So a cultural definition and a political definition can be in tension. We need to know what we mean by the term, and the term is sometimes used simplistically. And I think we've heard over and over at this symposium that in doing work with men and in shifting gender relations, we have to start with good knowledge of local and national and indeed transnational formations of gender.
I think about your comments. I think that my idea of a gift is a re-engagement, and it's not like just like here's a gift and we're done. It's like the process of gift giving is in itself by definition a re-engagement and a forcible re-engagement with the state by that process of giving. And then as far as your comments, that you're totally right. I think that one of the dangers in my paper is that it kind of dehistoricizes the women's movement, which is totally not what it's meant to do. But it's like very limited in scope. It's an undergraduate thesis, but I really would like to do more work on kind of like bringing that historical aspect into it.
Thank you. I'll take 3 more. 4. I have to leave the room at 6:30.
Do you have to leave the room, or do we all have to leave the room?
We all have to leave the room. We will not get space upstairs. So, any one of you still wants to ask your question, I will honor you.
Yes,
1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Philip. I come from Kenya. My question really goes to anybody within the panel. In as far as where do we move forward in terms of working with men and boys? Because all I'm hearing since I arrived here is that these research that have been conducted saying blah, 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 but then I've not really got to the point where we are saying this is what we ought to do. When Sanjeev tells us about all those men that he met, the way they're behaving and all these kind of things, I've not had tangible action points that we can take back home. I'm leaving this place and I still feel there's so much that needs to be done. How are we tackling culture? How are we tackling religion, which is at the heart of the formation of masculinity? Lastly, then we also need to know that when we talk about law, structure, systems and all that, at the core of changing the individual lies the systems change, structural change that we ought to do. But then how do we do that? And who do we involve? Who sits in those structures? Who sits in those systems that we're talking about? I would like to hear that more.
Yes.
I'll just forgo the other questions that I had and only ask one of David, because in the end that you suggested that violence can be used as a means also to problematize engagement with the state, that we are perpetuating structures which we are trying to fight. But then one has to perhaps also ask ourselves this question, that the state is also using violence as a tool. I mean, the instrument of violence and the use by the state, I mean, they would love it. Let's use violence. They can, outperform us in several ways. So what do you have to say to respond to this?
Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you. Can I just follow the earlier point by Wizillo and building on Phil's question, a fairly pragmatic question as well. But so we've heard a lot about at this conference about the engagement with feminism, which is a great step forward, and the recognition of the structural constraints and how that is hierarchical and how the top is dominated by men. And so my question is, my feeling at this conference is that there's still two huge areas where we don't see enough action. We don't know what to do in the work with men. One is this material oppression of women generally in terms of the care economy. There's a lot happening in feminism with a hidden care economy, double burden, and the men care work is still fairly focused on fatherhood and some caring in that. There is no connection there, or not a very strong one. The second area is this question about leadership in all these structures that we're targeting, including our own structures. How do, feminists have been fighting for decades and more than that on getting into parliaments, in getting into boards of businesses. What is the men's movement, or what the sector, what are we doing to support that movement of getting women representation and voice in those spaces? That, I see those two things as the two key priorities for moving forward over the next 5 years. And what do you as a panel think we should pragmatically do in terms of supporting the women's movements and linking with them practically in those two areas?
Very good question. I'll take a last one here.
Yeah, I think it's very much related to what the previous speaker has made about this violence thing. I think the last speaker was saying that violence under certain circumstances are not considered as violence. I think that seems a little bit, dangerous move for us, which doesn't really take us to, get that the greater good. Violence probably take us to, more chaotic and more dangerous and harmonious. It would really come a very harmonious, outcomes than what we gain out of that reaction. So, for me, it is good to see development as a long journey. Changes are happening, and we should really see in that way than using violence as an instrument to get the greater good.
Okay, we will close with 30 seconds for each. 1 minute. but I would appreciate if you would stay in the room to hear them as well, please, otherwise they'll get disturbed.
Can I start? Yeah. Okay. So just very briefly, I think that there has to be a distinction between institutional violence, which is what the state and what patriarchy is performing upon people's bodies, and violence onto the institution. I think violence onto the institution is very different, and I think that it is dangerous. But I think that you need danger. You need people need to be angry, and we need to be like out there smashing capitalism and patriarchy and the nation state. And that's what I would say. Also, like that's kind of like a kind of a ridiculous too big answer to I think a question that is very, very deep and complex. But it's like smash patriarchy, like go out, like end capitalism, like smash capitalism, smash the nation state, like that. Those I think are going to be the way in which we're going to end sexual violence.
This thing is flashing 0, 0, 0. So look, what should we do? There's not enough time to say what we should do, but I'm good at collecting other people's answers to what we should do. XY Online is a website that it's gone off the screen. Anyway, XY Online has manuals and guides, and what there is in terms of the best thinking out there, which is also reflected to some degree, is reflected in this room and elsewhere. So please send me your stuff, and I'll make that available. So that's how we can change the world.
Oh. I'll look at this website.
Okay.